Wow, that's really that's really thought out. That's really cool. Now, another question is, who are you? Maybe a short introduction to what you do as well.
Actually, I could just go to my first slide. My background, working for the European Space Agency, designing rockets and spacecraft. At the moment, most of my design work is designing chain drives for the British Olympic cycling team. The first project was Rio Olympics, then Tokyo, now designing for Paris. Actually, we've finished the Paris design, now designing for Los Angeles. Wow. I published lots of papers on design and biomechanics, so I have an interest in design and engineering and also design and biology, and had academic posts in this country and also America, Liberty University in America.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. And last question, what has been your favourite project to work on in your time as an engineer?
Yeah, definitely for the British Olympic cycling team, go up to the National Velodrome Centre in Manchester, and I'm allowed to use the same canteen as Laura Kenny and the other top cyclists. The food is absolutely fantastic, and it's great working with those great athletes as well as being really great fun.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to pray for you now. So, yeah. And then we can start. Thank you, Lord, so much today to have Stuart with us. Please use him and speak through him to us so we can learn lots about the world you've created and why you've created it this way, Lord. And just thank you for everyone here, Lord, that we can have open ears to listen to your message. In the name of Jesus, Amen. And now on to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. I hope I have some interesting, fun slides to show you. I thought maybe the simplest thing is simply to give a list of reasons why I believe in intelligent design. That's been a question that many students have asked me over the years. I've been mainly at Bristol University the last 27 years. In the first few years I was at Bristol, I did kind of mention believing in intelligent design in some of my lectures, but I got into deep trouble doing that, so I stopped doing it. But I find the students look me up on the web, and so they still ask me questions about intelligent design. And they often say, why do I believe in intelligent design? So the first reason is incredible complexity of life. One of the projects I worked on was a bio-inspired, dragonfly-inspired micro air vehicle, kind of a spying device, sponsored by Ministry of Defence. And we produced a book, published in New Scientist. It was a really humbling project because we could not match the performance of dragonflies. Our machine could only go 10 flaps per second. A real dragonfly can go 40 flaps per second. And it was one of those projects where I thought, as an engineer, I've got no constraints, I can use the best materials, but I cannot match what this dragonfly can do. And many scientists argue that must demonstrate that there's an intelligent designer for dragonflies if we can't even match the performance of these creatures that are supposedly here by chance. A dragonfly has better aerodynamics than the best fighter plane designed by humans. If you're interested, you could look up the Globe Skinner. It migrates 18,000 kilometers over 4 generations. So the baby dragonflies have to continue on a precise migration path. They're programmed to do that, to follow the Earth's magnetic field and other cues. It's quite astonishing what they can do. I've also worked on bird flight. This is an equation that I developed for modelling how birds flap their wings. Birds like Arctic tern, when they're on that huge migration. Engineers cannot begin to match the performance of an actual bird. So I know lots of engineers who've tried to create a flapping bird, and it's very humbling again because you just cannot begin to match the performance of an actual bird. I mentioned the Arctic tern. It has a 50,000 kilometre annual migration circuit and it only weighs 100 grams, engineers would say that must be impossible to do, and yet birds can do it. So again, this kind of incredible design, I think, is great evidence for a creator. At this point, I should just mention that I've been in academia over 30 years, and I think my biggest surprise is how many academics either believe in intelligent design or at least are sympathetic to intelligent design. When you look at the media, you get the impression that university is full of atheists, but that is absolutely not true. I would say the majority of my academic colleagues find it very easy to speak to me about intelligent design. Most of them are at least sympathetic to intelligent design. But we have this weird system that academics are not allowed to talk about intelligent design to the media on television because we have this kind of unwritten rule that everything must be a humanist kind of world view. God's not allowed in the lecture room or the research room. But in private, most academics are sympathetic towards intelligent design for the reasons that I'm going to give in this talk. I've also done a lot of work on fish jaws. If you're interested, you could look up a review paper I did in the Institute of Physics quite recently. And the reason for writing that paper, I analysed 10 linkage mechanisms in fish. The reason I did it was to present evidence of intelligent design, because these linkage mechanisms are what's called irreducibly complex. They cannot evolve step by step. And a lot of biologists and engineers are recognizing this, and I published this in the Institute of Physics. It doesn't mention God and in irreducible complexity, but it's fairly obvious what I'm arguing about in that paper. Number 2, the origin of life. So by the origin of life, where did life come from? Can life just come from a chemical soup? And this is often taught as a kind of fact. If you do GCSE biology, A-level biology, life can come from a chemical soup. So in the last 30 years, I've often spoken to senior biologists, like at Bristol University, top academics, professors of biology, who don't have any religious agenda. And I've said to them, what do you think about the origin of life? Life could come from a chemical soup, abiogenesis. And most of them say it's complete rubbish. There is not a shred of evidence that life could come from a chemical soup. These are the top professors of biology. The only people who really believe it are the very junior biologists, because they think the senior ones believe it, but the senior ones know there is not a shred of evidence for abiogenesis. So this is another reason I believe in that. Let me just give you a quote by Richard Dawkins, who is very confident about evolution. This is what he said: "We have no evidence about what the first step in making life was, but we do know the kind of step it must have been. It must have been whatever it took to get natural selection started by some process as yet unknown." So he's basically saying, I haven't got a clue, but I'm very confident in my faith in atheism. So he has absolutely blind faith in abiogenesis. So if this is what the most confident person believes, for those of you interested in it, you could look up this news release in 2022. The reason this is significant is that this is the simplest known life form that can't actually live on its own, but it's the simplest known life form. And it has 160,000 base pairs of DNA. So this is a really big challenge to the theory that life could just come from a chemical soup, because there's no such thing as simple life. Because if there's nothing simpler than that, then, for life to spring from a chemical soup, it would need to have like 10 pieces of information, and 10 is a number which is a lot less than 160,000. So you need this absolute mountain of blind faith to believe in abiogenesis. And my colleagues, even in the biology department, they say to me, Stuart, we need much more faith than you do, because you believe in something that's needed, which is this creative God who has almighty power. But we have blind faith in evolution of the gaps. We have a God of the gaps. People will often say, but how about the Miller-Urey experiment that's taught in GCSE A-level biology? But if you speak to a senior biologist, and here's just one example, Paul Davis, they will say that that experiment represents zero progress towards a biogenesis, because it was basically building like a brick. And if you speak to an architecture, I know there's one architect in here, if you say, look, I know how to produce a brick, therefore it's obvious I could produce any kind of building, there's a lot more to a building than just a brick. So that's not progress at all. And interestingly, the co-founder of the theory of evolution was Alfred Russel Wallace. One of the reasons he did not get on with Darwin is because Alfred Wallace said, this theory of evolution can never explain the origin of life. He was a co-founder of the theory. And Darwin and other atheists didn't like him. But he was correct. And he's been proved correct through all the ages. Another reason I believe in intelligent design, not just the origin of life, but the origin of kinds. One of my own areas is aerodynamics and flight. In 1804, there was the invention of the aerofoil. And despite thousands of very talented engineers working on flight, it took 98 years before controlled flight came. And it only came because the Wright brothers studied bird flight, interestingly, God's design, which is why many scientists argue you cannot just produce bird flight by chance, some process of gradual evolution. And if you look at the fossil record, there is no intermediates between land creatures and flying creatures. And then there's irreducible complexity. One of my favourite top PhD students was Apo Apollinaire, who's now a lecturer at UWE in the engineering department. And he did a whole PhD on the human knee joint. And he's still working on the knee joint at the University of West of England. The knee joint is a wonderful example of irreducible complexity because there's a 4-bar linkage in all of your knees. You have a 4-bar linkage with the cruciate ligaments. But like a car steering system or car suspension system, you cannot produce this by chance. Everything has to be fitting in place. In fact, you need a master's in mechanical engineering to understand how to put a 4-bar linkage system together. And I mentioned already the linkage systems in fish jewels are even more complicated. And many scientists see this as great evidence for intelligent design. Then there's the origin of man. We're told that humans are supposedly 95% the same as chimpanzees. I've actually got a couple of books here. I've written a whole book on why we're not related to apes. And in my book, I argue the difference is not 5%, but 100% difference. One of the reasons being apes are quadrupeds and humans are bipeds, something I lecture on at Bristol University. There are hundreds of design details that make a creature optimized for bipedal walking and running. Just to give you a couple of examples, ape hands are designed for strength. Human hands are designed for skill and have quite a few features that you do not see in ape hands. When you actually look at the details, the difference is absolutely huge. And not only that, but I could give you a long list of quotations here of biologists who admit that the monkey to man charts are not based on science but just fake ideas. So it's not me saying this. These are quotations that you can look up where people will say those monkey to man charts are not based on real science. They shouldn't be in the schoolrooms. And just one thing worth remembering from this talk is a difference between observational science and historical science. Observational science is very reliable. When you're designing an aeroplane, you can really have confidence in science, but you cannot have great confidence in historical science. That is a different kind of science, and that is the science around the evolution of man, evolution of life. Just to give you a couple of examples, in 1922 there were world headlines and this picture that they had proven the existence, they found an ape man. 5 years later they discovered it was a pig, not a man. So there's an example of you shouldn't have high confidence in historical science. In 1912, in this country, they discovered what they thought was Piltdown Man, proof that there was a missing link between apes and man. And for over 40 years, it was presented as a fact, taught to children. It was found to be a complete fraud in 1953. It was just completely 100% made up by this bad academic. So I'm just illustrating the point. Historical science can be utterly, utterly wrong. So if someone says, be confident in science, yeah, be confident in observational science, but question historical science. The human body is wonderfully designed. A lot of my papers have been on knee joints, ankle joints, foot joints, the design of the human body. And the last 30 years has really encouraged me in my faith, confirmed my faith, seeing the truth of that verse in Psalm 139, verse 14. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. It's absolutely correct. Actually, one of my last papers was just a couple of months ago, actually, in the Journal of Biomimetics, the one on the right. My team of students, Bristol University, we produced a bio-inspired foot mimicking the toe joints, and that was published in quite a good journal, Biomimetics. The year before, I published a paper in the States, Why the Ankle-Foot Complex is a Masterpiece of Engineering and a Rebuttal of Bad Design Arguments, because some people are trying to argue that the human body is badly designed, believe it or not. I've also worked on the hand, one paper I've produced, and the hand is an absolutely wonderful, incredible design. If you speak to the people at BRL, Bristol Robotics Laboratory, I've done a lot of work in that wonderful lab, and they will explain that all the robots that engineers design don't come anywhere near to matching the performance of the human hand. I could do a whole lecture on that. I also have an interest in aesthetics. I teach aesthetics at Bristol University, and I've actually published some work on the beauty of the peacock feather. There's a huge amount of information that goes into creating the beauty of a peacock feather. It has thin film interference, like a digital pattern, masses of information in the genetic code to produce that incredible beauty, and atheists have no idea where the information came from, but it screams intelligent design by a God who loves beauty. Just to pick out a couple of details, actually, do you notice there are borders? Notice there's an anti-border at the top. There's like a gap where the feather stems go up. Some of the hairs are missing to create an anti-border. Now, if a student had submitted that to an aesthetics course at UWE, I can guarantee they would get a fantastically high mark for aesthetics, not just for the ellipsoids and the lovely mathematical shapes, but such clever bordering and patterning. And the features are very, very subtle. On almost all feathers, you have a white stem. But interestingly, you have a brown stem. If it was a white stem, it would slightly spoil the colours of the peacock feather. So the stem is deliberately coloured brown. It's an incredibly subtle feature. The stem is also particularly thin, because if the stem was thick, that would spoil the aesthetics. Most interesting is that the stem finishes here. Why does the stem finish there? because if the stem went through the whole feather, it would slightly spoil the aesthetics of the feather. The aesthetics are so unbelievably subtle. You could write a whole book on the aesthetics of a feather. So the stem finishes there because the barbs gradually point vertically. They start vertical and they come down so that they're angled, then gradually go vertical, all so the stem does not spoil the pattern. It's absolutely incredible, the subtle features to make that beauty. And they've done tests on the female, because this is the male, the peacock, the male peahen. They've looked at the female, the peahen, peafowl, and she can't even recognize these details. So the atheist humanist has no answer to the origin of this this beauty. In one of my books, I talk about birdsong. I use music as an introduction to teaching aesthetics at Bristol University. I don't show them this slide, but on the top line is music by J.S. Bach. It starts on a keynote, has two phrases, linked by anticipation, finishes with finality with a major third. The bottom music is by a blackbird, and it has every one of the features of the musical features in J.S. Bach. If a musicologists have looked at the music of birds and said, if a human wrote this, you would think they have a degree in music, and yet this has come from birds, and it has absolutely astonished musicologists. To me, birdsong is my most favourite example of evidence for intelligent design. I think it's the last one, and it's homology. Now, homology, this is something I'm working on at the moment. I'm just about to produce a journal paper on this. Darwin said this was his greatest evidence of rejecting intelligent design, because the layout of the vertebrate limb is the same for reptiles, amphibians, mammals, birds. And he knew nothing about design, of course, but he said, I can imagine that shows there isn't a designer. He just speculated. And in the last 150 odd years, everyone has just copied Darwin and said, yeah, without actually thinking it through, without thinking of design, they said, yeah, shows there's no designer. I'm just about to produce a journal paper and probably a book showing that Darwin is completely incorrect. The vertebrate limb is exactly what an intelligent designer would do for each of those creatures. Just to give you an example, this was from quite recently, actually, in the Daily Mail, but there were world headlines when a whale was dissected and underneath was a hand. And all of the headlines were, a whale doesn't need a hand. It's a stupid design. This shows there's no intelligent designer. Why would a whale have a hand? And there were headlines around the world saying the same thing. But the paper I'm producing is explaining that a hand like that is exactly what you'd expect in a whale flipper. It absolutely needs that hand. And this is one of the pictures from my paper. They've dissected whales, and the fingers and the wrist are fully functioning with fully functioning muscles, and it needs those muscles to fine-tune stiffness and shape in the flippers of whales as they swim. It's a bit like when I use the analogy of swimming crawl with your legs and your hands. You have to stiffen and fine-tune the shape. So Darwin was wrong, and that's going to be the subject of my next paper. Just to mention one other thing, I'm also interested in the history of intelligent design, and an interesting thing is that if you look at history, evolutionary philosophy did not come through science. It came through humanist thinking, Thomas Huxley and Julian Huxley. It was Julian Huxley who really brought in the assumption that you cannot have God in the classroom. And Julian Huxley was president of the British Humanist Society. He was the one who decided God would have to be ruled out. It did not come through science. If you look up quotations of famous scientists like Lord Kelvin, Sir Ambrose Fleming, incredible, world famous scientists, they did not like this humanist evolutionary worldview. But students are not told about these quotations, and there are a lot of these. My friend at Bristol University, Professor Alan Linton, he was head of microbiology at Bristol University. He wrote the foreword to my book, and he bravely said, evolution is a man-made theory. The whole point is to support atheism. And he was head of microbiology, and he was quite a famous professor around the world. And I know two other famous professors there who would say a kind of similar thing to him, at least, very skeptical about evolutionary philosophy. I think that's enough for the presentation. We can have time for questions now.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That really just put everything into perspective really well. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to try to put the Slido code up again. I'm going to leave a box also down there if you just want to write it down instead of opening the Slido webpage. And then we could have a period of questions in about 5-10 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Please ask away. First question, which I think kind of gets asked a bit, is do dinosaurs show up in the Bible? And what does the Bible say about that?
In the book of Job, I think it mentions a couple of creatures that are gigantic and have gigantic tails, and people think that is a reference to dinosaurs. Other thing I would say about dinosaurs is that they're incredibly well designed. The Bible does talk about the whole world is in decay, so the Bible predicts that a lot of creatures are becoming extinct, and we see a lot of extinction. So the fact that dinosaurs became extinct, that's all part of a decaying world. So to me, dinosaurs fit in perfectly well with the biblical worldview.
Fantastic, thank you very much. One of the questions that was asked is why do the atheists you work with say it takes more faith to believe in no designer and yet don't seek God?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, in my 30 years in academia, I've not met many atheists. The people I was quoting were agnostic, so the vast majority of my colleagues are agnostic. There's a small percentage who are atheist and a small percentage who are religious. So it's those agnostics who said they need more faith because they're trying to believe that life just jumps from a chemical soup when it's been scientifically proven it can't happen, but they don't have a God to make it happen. They're whereas they know that I believe I'm actually acknowledging that you need God to make it all happening. So they're saying they need faith in this vacuum, whereas I've got faith in this God.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Another question is, do you think there is a possibility of evolution, not all of it, and intelligent design, both explaining God's handwork, but from different points of view?
Yeah, maybe this is thinking of things like, did God use a process of evolution? In Genesis chapter 1, it says God created kinds which would reproduce after its kind, and creationists believe that's like families of animals, so the dog kind, the finch kind, the cat kind. And I believe that science very much has demonstrated that to be true, that those creatures, you can get wonderful speciation of finches. Darwin's finches is a wonderful example of adaptation, which is obviously something that happens. But all the evidence is the finches don't turn into another kind of creature. And dogs, wonderful variation in dogs, but they don't turn into something else. So I think both the Bible and science point to God initially creating an orchard of creatures that then speciated into a vast variety. So I do not believe God directed a process of just chance things evolving.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. Another question. All of intelligent design implies that there is a creator. But how would you go beyond that and point people to Christianity instead of other religions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Last September, I was invited to India to talk about intelligent design. And I was invited to a conference where there were lots of Hindus. And they said, why does the intelligent designer point to the God of the Bible and not to, for example, Hinduism? One of the things I explained is that scientists have looked at the Earth and found an incredible harmony in the way different subsystems work together. You can see it in the atmosphere, also in the animal kingdom. And in engineering, perhaps in architecture as well, we have this saying that if you see a really bad building, that's been designed by a committee, not by one designer. And the world looks so uniformly, harmoniously beautiful and brilliantly harmoniously worked together that cannot be a committee of 100 Hindu gods. It wouldn't be so beautiful and harmonious. It's got to be one God, and that's the God of the Bible. It makes sense that a creator would reveal himself with a written testimony, and the Bible has been proven to be the oldest book, and it makes complete sense that would be God's revelation to man.
Fantastic, thank you very much. A slightly more personal question. Were you a believer when you began your kind of engineering and scientific journey, or what led you to your faith in that sense?
Yeah, I come from a non-Christian family. I hadn't been to an evangelical church of any kind before going to university. Went to university in Brunel in London, and in my first year, a friend invited me to a meeting just like this. And they were talking about creation, origins, and it blew my mind. I'd never heard anything like this before. And I was instantly convinced, I think partly because I'm an engineer, I know design does not happen by chance. So it really made sense to me there would be a creator and that he would reveal himself. And the Bible seemed to have this authority of being true, but probably an even bigger evidence of design than design in nature was I could see the Christians had had their lives turned around, and that definitely could not happen by chance. So there must be a real God. And quickly I was going along to a local evangelical church, and within a few months I was converted.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. In light of what you mentioned about historical science not being super accurate, could you give more examples on that, and maybe also comment on how accurate carbon dating is?
Ooh, yeah. I was kind of half hoping those questions wouldn't come along. No, it's a good question. I mean, this is it's a controversial thing. Yeah, some Christians believe in an old earth, some Christians believe in a young earth. But one thing I would say, if you, for example, take decaying elements like uranium decaying into lead, so some scientists would say there's a lot of lead in the world, so the world must be billions of years old if there's a lot of lead here. And one thing I say is that it's very hard to know exactly what happened in the past. For example, if when God created the world, he would have known humans needed a fantastic range of materials to make Olympic bicycles, guttering, motor cars. We could not do engineering without lead. You need lead. It's one of the softest, it's incredibly useful material, not just for guttering, but lots of engineering things. So I believe when God created the world, he would have wanted to put lead in the world as a useful material for man. So this is a difference between an engineering purpose-driven creation as opposed to this scientific, the world is a virgin, creation. And so when we see lead in the world, I see that as a sign of God's goodness. God giving us lead. He created lead as lead. So the existence of lead does not necessarily mean the world is billions of years old. So there are all these kind of assumptions. As soon as you allow the possibility of supernatural creation by a supernatural creator, it means it's very difficult to know what happened in the past, because you don't know if like Adam and Eve would have looked probably your age, actually, 21, 22, on the day they were made. They would have not looked 0 on the day they were eating apples, and the trees wouldn't have looked 0 age. So it's very difficult to analyse things from the past without knowing those starting assumptions.
That very nicely leads us on to one of our last questions, which is, what is a scientific view of the creation story in Genesis, and is there any evidence that the world could have been created that way?
Yeah, it's a kind of related question. I believe, I don't find it difficult to believe in Genesis chapter 1, God creating the world in 6 days. Just to give you one example, in the New Testament we read Jesus turned water into wine in a split second. If you ask a winemaker how long it takes to create good, mature wine, they would say it takes at least several years. And even cheap wine takes many, many months to go through the fermentation. And if you say, could you speed it up into a split second? They'll say, no, it's impossible. But Jesus, not only could he raise people from the dead, but he could turn water into wine in a split second. And so when you're dealing with the supernatural, of course God could make the world in 6 days. He could do anything. And so for God, that's just absolutely simple to do. So I think it's because I'm an engineer. I can easily believe God created it that way. And you see, if you speak to an engineer, if someone says, or an architect, I want a building or I want a car, you don't say, well, I'd just quite like to make this in 50 years, come back in 50 years. If you can do it in 2 years, then you do it in 2 years. So if God created the world for man, for life, which is what the Bible says, I don't think God's going to hang around. He's just going to, like Jesus in his ministry, he made things happen straight away. And I think that's God's character, and he has the power and ability to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got one last question. Any other questions you do have, please just come up. Stuart is going to stay for a little while after you want to ask any questions. And any other questions, do come on Friday. We're going to have a panel of 5 people, 6 people maybe. 6 people, I'll be told. To answer any of the questions regarding lots of different things. So please do come and ask those questions again. That'd be absolutely fantastic. Yep.
Sorry, just one last thing before we close. I have some free books. 2, The Design and Origin of Man. He Made the Stars, The Star of Bethlehem, Life Stories, and there's only one copy, God's Way for Romance. So they're free. If you're interested, you can take one.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And last question. Is there anything in the Bible that kind of explains something scientific or sciencey, or if not, why not?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I already gave the example in Genesis 1. God created kinds. They reproduce according to their kind. Interestingly, I think it's Genesis 31. It talks about inheritance of spots in sheep. So you have genetic variation there. So, and in the book of Job, I think it talks about the circle of the earth, and he hangs the earth on nothing. So you have lots of teasing kind of hints of what have turned out to be true things. But in the New Testament, it talks about true science and false science, true knowledge, false knowledge. So the Bible definitely talks a lot about things related. And in Romans chapter 1, it talks about those who suppress the truth to deny God. So the most important thing is that the Bible talks about the spiritual battle for truth. That's the most important thing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Can we have another round for applause for Stuart? Yeah. And thank you very much for all your questions. Please do come down. There's so many snacks. Please eat them. I don't want to put them away. And have some time chatting amongst yourselves and also asking Stuart questions. And thank you so much for coming tonight.